In these Wednesday services, we've been looking at the deliberate choices that Jesus made that led to him being arrested, convicted, and killed on a cross. Tonight we look at one of the biggest ones. Jesus went to the temple courts, took a whip, chased the money changers out of there, turned over the tables, told the people that they had turned a holy place into a marketplace. Now, some of you know this, but for those who may not, here's a little bit of the context of this. When people would come to the temple in Jerusalem, they were required to either pay some money or to sacrifice an animal. But the money they used could only be the local currency that they used in Jerusalem, and the animal could only be one that was bought at the temple with that local currency. Of course, people came from all over the known world to worship at the temple. The temple was the high holy place of all Jewish people. So when these people came from all over, they brought the money that, of course, what was used where they came from, they had to exchange it for that local Jerusalem currency to either pay the temple tax or to buy an animal to sacrifice. And so that is, of course, where the money changers come into the picture. They'd exchange other types of money for that local Jerusalem currency. And to do this, they set up shop right in the middle of the temple courts, right next to where the money was supposed to be paid. And of course, they did not do this money changing for free. There was a charge involved, and that charge could be pretty much whatever they wanted, because after all, what could you do? There was no other place you could go to do this. You had to have Jerusalem money. The only place you could get it from was from these money changers. You had to have the local animal to sacrifice. The only place you could get it was from the people in the temple courts. So these money changers and sellers of animals made out pretty well. The temple courts were supposed to be a holy place, and here these people were making money off of it. Not only that, they were making more money than any reasonable person would think was fair, and they were doing it with the blessing of the Jewish authorities. In fact, sometimes those authorities were the money changers themselves. Jesus was outraged, and he reacted. And as we look at it, we can understand Jesus' outrage. But at the time, nobody else seemed to be particularly outraged at this. This was just the way things were. Maybe people grumbled about it privately, we don't know, but looks like most people, even if they were not very happy about it, they just accepted it. It was just the way it was. You did what you had to do, and life went on. This passage is often used as an example of how in his earthly life Jesus could get angry. And he was angry, no question about that. But I don't think that this was a case of Jesus just blowing his top and reacting without thinking. I think even though Jesus was angry, he still knew what he was doing. I think these actions of Jesus were a deliberate choice that he made. And he made that choice knowing that this was going to upset the apple cart terribly, and that the Jewish authorities were going to be really upset with him for doing this. And so, as we've done with all the other choices of Jesus we've looked at, we need to look at two questions. Why did Jesus do this? And what can we learn from it? Jesus had other options, you know. He could have just accepted the situation. As we said, that's pretty much what everybody else seems to have done. Could have just grumbled about it. I'm sure, again, that some people did that. He could have gone to the temple authorities privately and said, you know, this really is not right. Maybe we ought to make some changes with this. He could have spoken out against the situation publicly, gave speeches about it, tried to encourage other people to make changes in this system. Could have gone directly to the money changers, chewed them out, told them they were all sinners, they needed to change their ways. There were all kinds of things Jesus could have done, short of turning over tables and going after people with a whip. But Jesus did not do any of those things. All those other options, would have gotten Jesus into a lot less trouble with the authorities than what it was he did. But still, Jesus chose to do it the way he did it. He chose to take that whip and chase people, chase them out of the temple. Why would Jesus do that? Sounds kind of extreme, don't you think? I mean, we're always told that when there's a conflict, we need to communicate, we need to talk to each other, we need to look for common ground, we need to try to find a way to compromise. Besides, Jesus was the Prince of Peace, right? This is not exactly a peaceful action that Jesus was doing. What was the Prince of Peace doing running around with a whip? This was violent. We're always told violence never solves anything. And again, this was going to get Jesus into all kinds of trouble. Why would he do this? When thinking about that, let's start with the words of Jesus that are given to us. Jesus is quoted in this gospel saying, "Get out of here, stop turning my Father's house into a market." In Matthew's gospel, Jesus is quoted as saying, "It is written, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." And Mark's version is similar. He has Jesus saying, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, and you are turning it into a den of robbers." We're also told in John, the disciples remembered the words of Psalm 69, "Zeal for your house will consume me." I think then that Jesus did this because the temple courts were supposed to be a holy place. This was the place where God's presence could be felt more than any other. It's supposed to be a place where everyone would be equal before God, where everyone would come to worship God, to confess their sins to God, to receive God's forgiveness and God's blessing. Instead, now it was a place where not only was everybody not equal, but where people were being taken advantage of, even robbed. And that was being done in the name of God. And Jesus decided that that situation was one that could not be tolerated. It could not be compromised. It was wrong. It was bad. It was evil. And Jesus did not see any point in talking with evil. He did not see any common ground that could be found with evil. He could not see any advantage in trying to compromise with evil. The only thing that could be done with evil was to defeat it and drive it out. Jesus decided he had to do that no matter what it took to do it, and no matter what the consequences would be to him. And I think that's the lesson for us. When we see a situation that is evil, it cannot be compromised and it cannot be tolerated. Evil must be defeated and driven out, period. But notice, we need to apply this lesson very carefully. This is the only time that it's recorded that Jesus did something like this. There were times he spoke out against things, of course. There were times he spoke out against people. But we're not given any other instance where Jesus actually physically attacked people. So we need to know what it was about this specific situation that made Jesus decide that this was so evil that this extreme measure had to be taken. And just as important, we need to know what it was about other situations that made Jesus decide that they were not evil, or at least not as evil, not in this way, not to cause this kind of reaction. Now, for one thing, it was not the fact that sin was involved here. And Jesus ran into sin all the time, all of his life. Some of his best friends were the people whom society had declared to be sinners. So the fact that the money changers were sinners was not the problem. And it was not that this was something that violated the societal standards of the day. It was not even something that violated the religious standards of the day. Society approved of this. The religious leaders approved of this. So that was not the problem either. And we also need to note that this was not an action that Jesus reacted against. This action was not something that was done personally against him. Jesus was not physically harmed by what was going on. Jesus was not emotionally harmed by what was going on. In fact, when people did harm Jesus physically, even when they turned on him and betrayed him, he not only allowed it all to happen, he betrayed the people he forgave the people who did it. He forgave the people who betrayed him. So it was not that it was a personal thing that got Jesus so upset. And it was not simply that people were making money that got Jesus upset either. There were lots of people around in Jesus' time who made money, just as there are now. There are plenty of rich people in Jesus' time, just as there are now. Sometimes they took advantage of people. Jesus did not condemn them, at least not in this way. Not saying Jesus approved of taking advantage of people. He certainly did not. But He did not take after those people with a whip either. So there had to be more to it than that. And I think what it was is that Jesus thought this was a deliberate insult against God. It was not just that it was wrong, not just that it was breaking God's laws, not just that it was sinful. What made this evil in Jesus' eyes, I think, so evil that it could not be tolerated, so evil that it had to be defeated and driven out, was that this was a wrong being done by the religious leaders, by people who knew exactly what they were doing, for their own personal gain. It was being done in a place that had been set apart as holy, a place where God's presence was to be felt. In other words, the religious leaders deliberately took something that was supposed to be used for the worship of God and used it for their own personal benefit. They claimed to be God's greatest champions, and yet they were showing that they did not care about God at all. They were just using God to make money. And that is what made what they were doing evil, I think. That's why Jesus could not and would not tolerate it, would not and could not compromise with it. He had to drive it out, no matter what the cost to him might be. When you read Jesus' words, he calls on us to accept a lot of things that we might otherwise consider intolerable. Wrongful actions, personal insults, all sorts of things. But when we just see deliberate insults to God by people who know what they're doing, for no reason other than their own personal gain, I think Jesus is telling us we should not accept that. We should not tolerate it. Now, I'm not suggesting we all go out and buy whips, but I am suggesting that there are certain situations that cannot be compromised and cannot be tolerated. They don't happen often, but they do happen. When they do, we need to be ready and prepared to stand up for our faith, regardless of what the consequences might be. Amen.